Good morning, everyone. We're going to let the participants log in, and we will get started in just another minute. All right, good morning from the West Coast and UCLA, where as a land-grant institution, we pay tribute to the Gabrielino and Tabonga peoples as the traditional caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. Good morning, and thank you for joining our workshop today on strategies in mitigating disclosure risk. This is a workshop presented by the National Network of Health Surveys through a broader program we have going on, advancing the disaggregation of ethnic and racial data through technical assistance, training, and case making. This is part of our training, and if you'd like more information about our technical assistance, please may remember to fill out the post-workshop survey and let us know what your technical assistance needs are. For today, please use the chat for general questions, comments, and discussion amongst yourselves. But if you have a question for our wonderful panelists today, please use the Q&A function so that we can capture all of the questions that get answered. And as a reminder, please, after this workshop, we will put the link to the survey in the chat, and we will also, it's also available on the National Network's website. Please go and fill out and let us know how we're doing and what other topics you'd like to see more information about. The National Network of Health Surveys is a broad voluntary network consisting of survey leaders, health data users, foundations, federal agencies that are all interested in the same goal of providing data among all kinds of health data resources, not just surveys, but data to inform health policy that is high quality, that can be used at national, state, and local levels, that is comparable to other national health data resources, and that are available and highly usable. So we are doing these technical assistance workshops through a health data lens, but really there's a lot of data sources that this information applies to. So no matter where you fit on the spectrum, we're glad you're here today and hope that you'll get a lot out of what we're doing. So again, we are here providing technical assistance to address barriers to disaggregation. We know there's a lot of challenges to getting at some of these hidden populations in data, but we're here to help to identify some of those barriers and give you strategies and techniques to try to address some of them. So today I am going to throw it to the East Coast for an important discussion on strategies in mitigating disclosure risk. Our panelist today is Darius Singperwala. He is a mathematical statistician with the National Science Foundation's National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, and we are very privileged to have him speaking with us today. Darius, I am now going to throw it to you.
Okay. Can everyone see the slides?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks again for inviting me here to talk with you today. I'm going to talk about confidentiality and disclosure avoidance techniques, primarily the ones that we use in the federal government, but they are pretty they're pretty straightforward, so they can easily be adopted by pretty much anyone who's interested in protecting some of the data that that you might be collecting. So just a quick introduction again. As AJ mentioned, my name is Darius Singh Prawala, and I'm a mathematical statistician at the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. My title there is mathematical statistician, and I have a master's degree in statistics. It was a very applied degree that taught me a lot of different techniques that I can use to analyze data. And I also have a doctorate in a field called, well, the doctorate's in kinesiology, but my specific focus was a field called exercise psychology. And I primarily study what motivates people to exercise. Before working for the federal government, I worked in the private sector for several years as both a database marketer, which surprisingly used a lot of sophisticated statistical techniques, and also as a management consultant, just helping businesses solve general problems that they had. I've been a Fed for about 10 years at the National Science Foundation, and even though my title is mathematical statistician, I spend a lot of my time focusing on the center's business rules, which includes the statistical standards that we've written that define what we publish as official statistics. And in addition to that, disclosure is a part of what I oversee as well. We, as a federal government, have a legal responsibility to protect the identity of the individuals who provide information to the government. We do that through a few laws that I'll talk about a little bit later on, but also in terms of the suppression rules that apply to our data to protect the confidentiality of our respondents, as well as our NCSCS's remote access procedures, which is a way that approved researchers can access our most sensitive data. So an overview of what I'm going to go over today. I've pretty much done the introduction. I will go over some definitions that we use often in confidentiality, in the world of confidentiality. And then I'd like to, I decided to structure the talk by discussing a little bit about the history of confidentiality within the federal government and how this history has led to developments of more sophisticated disclosure avoidance techniques throughout the years as the public has become a bit more particular about how data that they provide to collectors is being used. And at the end of the day, I'll leave you with a couple of resources that the government has put together about disclosure that we've made available to the public. So just as I said before, I want to go over some definitions first. I want to review these definitions so we're all more or less on the same page, because there are a lot of related but different terms that are involved in confidentiality. So I think it's helpful to go over these things just to make sure that we've captured the nuances and what the difference is across these terms. So disclosure in general relates to an inappropriate attribution of information to a data subject, whether it's an individual or an organization. There are really two types of disclosures that can occur. One is an identity disclosure, and that's where a subject is identified from a released file. So NCSCS captures or conducts a census of every individual who has earned a doctorate in a US institution. If any doctorates are in the audience, you probably remember our survey of earned doctorates that was sent to you when you graduated. If someone could get their hands on this file, they might be able to review it and potentially identify myself or anyone in there. So that's what an identity disclosure is. The other type of disclosure that can occur is an attribute disclosure, and that's where the release data makes sensitive information about a data subject. So not necessarily the identity, but someone has been able to infer a sensitive piece of information, like someone's salary, for instance. Though that's something we want to avoid as well as that. We'll also talk about direct identifiers, and direct identifiers are variables that can be used to identify a person. And so that could be someone's name, their address, their social security number, a bank account could be something like that, or some sort of a student record number. Anything that a person could use to identify an individual within the data set. And then there's also indirect identifiers too. And those indirect identifiers tend to be demographic variables about a certain person that, usually used in combination with each other, could identify a person or potentially an attribute. So a lot of indirect identifiers that we like to protect against in the government is gender, race, age, and in particular, geographic location. Statistical disclosure limitation is, well, it's in essence what we strive to do in disclosure work. We want to avoid unmasking someone. We want to avoid a disclosure. So statistical disclosure limitation can be looked at as a collection of techniques that collectors employ to mask either the identity of a respondent or an attribute of a respondent. So those first four terms are common terms that we use in disclosure limitation, but the ones I think that tend to cause the most confusion is the differences between privacy and confidentiality. And it's really important to distinguish between the two of them. So because they can have different implications as to how one protects against them. Privacy is about the government's right, or any data collector's right, to ask a question in the first place. Think of it as the difference. Whereas confidentiality is the idea that I'm going to give you the information, but you as a data collector need to protect it so no one can use it to find out who I am or an attribute that I possess. So you can think of it as the difference between don't tell anyone what I told you, which would be confidentiality, versus don't ask me at all, it's none of your business, which is privacy. And so the distinction is being made so one can better understand how the separate definitions drive disclosure work within a field that I work in, which is in this case survey work, but any kind of data collection efforts can think about these things too. With respect to privacy, it's relatively simple to control for it, as you can imagine. Simply don't ask the question. It's not your business. And we had a controversy at that related to the 2020 census. The Trump administration wanted to include a citizenship question on the census, which made potential respondents somewhat prickly. And the reason being, from a decennial census purpose, the information is considered private. It's not necessary to collect citizenship information for the population to be enumerated, which is what the goal of the census is. The census is used to figure out how to appropriate funds for items such as highways and hospitals and other service that both citizens and non-citizens, will take advantage of. You're still, even if you're a non-citizen, you're still going to be driving on the same road. You're still going to be going to the same hospital that citizens do. So, the government needs to understand how many people are in a certain area so they can appropriate for it. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is a bit trickier. Here, the onus is on the data collector to ensure that the information that has been provided and the identity of the person who supplied the information is kept private and in an identifiable form. So really, both the data collectors and the individuals providing the responses have a vested interest in keeping the individual's responses confidential. And as we walk through the history of confidentiality and privacy, you'll understand a little bit better about this vested interest between of both the data collector and the respondent. So where did confidentiality come from? Well, it really, I mean, it probably came from something before this, but from the perspective of a data collector, it really emerged from practice, and usually through conflicts between respondents and investigators of sponsors and clients of research. If one kind of looks at the timeline of privacy protections as it relates to the census, the largest data collection effort in the United States, one can see how more sophisticated confidentiality protections take root as public opinion about privacy changed, as well as the introduction of sophisticated computing techniques that were, used to uncover the identity of respondents. So when I was crafting this presentation, I wanted to put together something that weaved together a bit of the history of confidentiality protection with the techniques and the law, because they all go together. Changes to confidentiality protection in the census is in part driven by public opinion. Essentially, the public finds out how its data is being collected and used by the government, and they may get upset about something that they're doing, and then the government responds. The response usually takes the form of legislation being written, and then it's the responsibility of the agencies to implement these various techniques to protect the data. So there's pretty significant interplay between these different elements, and each of them tend to drive innovation in confidentiality. So to help with this conceptualization, I tried to create 4 distinct time periods corresponding to the overall history of confidentiality with respect to the advancement of statistical disclosure limitation techniques, which is in response to public opinion. And the 4 phases that I grouped in were phase 1, which essentially had no privacy protections. This is the earliest view. This is the earliest types of the census, or the earliest versions of the census. Then phase 2 was people became upset about the nature of their information being made public. So phase 2 focused on protecting the identity of individuals and institutions that provided data. And then phase 3 focused on protecting information that can be uncovered using indirect identifiers. As we'll see when we talk about this in detail, it's really not enough to just protect the identity of people by blanking out their names and addresses and other direct identifiers. The indirect identifiers can be just as handy to uncover people's identities or attributes. Then the 4th phase, which we're really just getting under now, is more 20th century privacy threats. That's what I've labeled this. And these threats are more to do with computing power. We have much more powerful computers that can really manipulate data sets quite quickly. And the speed of this can lead to identity and attribute disclosures too. The mosaic effect refers to the ability for individuals with nefarious intentions to use different data products from the same data sets, and oftentimes other publicly available records, to identify the identity of an individual. So they don't just look at the results of the census, they use the results of the census with something like voting records, for instance, to try and identify the individual with someone. And then the availability of data online has really increased. We, as government agencies, we want to provide as much data that we possibly can to researchers to solve important problems, but at the same time, we need to respect the identity of our respondents, because if you don't do that, then they won't respond, and then we won't have any data to analyze. So this conceptualization is really mine only. It's not something that the federal government really looks at. So there's no formal Fed-wide definition of what these 4 phases are. They're just the chunks that I've developed to kind of help conceptualize the history of privacy. So phase 1 is no to limited privacy protection. A little bit of history about the census. When the census first started, the process was executed by US Marshals rather than dedicated census employees. So while federal marshals are most famous for their law enforcement, but since the inception of the office, they've often functioned as representatives of the federal government within their districts. They also do a surprisingly large amount of paperwork in terms of subpoenas and other legal documents that they would serve to the public. So I guess back in the day, it seemed natural that federal marshals would be, or the responsibility of enumerating the population would fall in federal marshals' wheelhouse. So as part of this, the federal marshals were trusted with carrying out the census of both individuals and business within their district. And their best tool for data quality was the respondents themselves. Anyone who's collected data before knows that there's a pretty reasonable chance that there'll be a mistake made in the collection or typing it into a form or something like that. So data quality is important. The marshals, I guess, had no intention of going back to everyone to double check their work. So they simply posted the results of the census in the town square for people to go and take a look at to make sure that their data was correct. So during this period, businesses were actually the first to voice issues with the way that the census results were posted in the town square. They rightfully felt that any business secrets they might be keeping or competition could learn about them. These secrets might be uncovered with the results posted. And then I think one of the most important milestones from this period was the decision that census processes were taken over by dedicated employees who would be subject to data quality and privacy standards that the federal marshals might not be too interested in adhering to. I don't know any federal marshals, and I certainly don't know what was going on back in the 1700s, but I figure marshals had a lot of different responsibilities, and adhering to privacy is probably not on the top of their list. So I think the idea that dedicated employees were hired to conduct the census processes that would be more in tune with quality and privacy standards, I think that that was a very important development in the history of privacy, at least from the federal government perspective. So here is just a motivating example of what one of these censuses that might be posted in the town square might look like. Consider this to be an example of the National Center for Science and Engineering's SED survey, a census of everyone who has gotten a doctorate degree in the past, ever, essentially. So the point of this slide is to show how census data was disseminated without any protections. Boom, they just put that up in the town square for people to use. It was simply listed as a public use file for the world to see, and the data quality was enforced by having people come to the town square, review their information, and fix it. So here my SSN is incorrect, so I might go to the marshal who took my area's census and tell him to fix it. He or she would, and then we would, be done with it. The slide has several direct identifiers that could cause people to be a bit nervous. It's got my name, it's got my SSN, it's got my name, and it's got my SSN. In addition to that, it's got several indirect identifiers such as the respondent's gender, his or her race, and one could look at the functional limitation as perhaps an indirect identifier, as well as the degree and the institution. I mean, all of those could be used as indirect identifiers to do to uncover my identity. So there's quite a bit of sensitive information in this file. There's salary limitations. My functional limitations are all pieces of information that I would rather not be made public about myself. So the Marshal's response to questions about confidentiality is simply to not make the file available. In fact, this was done in part due to abysmal response rates on the business census that Marshals were taking as well. Because the response rate was so low, because people were concerned about privacy, the Marshals were instructed to provide assurances about the privacy of the respondents. Eventually, census takers were instructed to consider all communication relative to the business of the people as strictly confidential. And this included the individual census, or the demographic census, as well as the establishment census. So even though the businesses were the first group to raise concerns about making this data available, individuals quickly followed suit. And the solution was for the Marshals to be like, fine, we're just not going to make the data available to anyone who doesn't need to see it. So you're going to get a hit in quality. Are there any questions about anything I've said so far that could be addressed now?
There are none in the Q&A yet, but
Okay.
I will let you know if any come up.
Great, thanks. The next phase is the next phase in the history of confidentiality took things a step further. So if census directors previously had been required to tell people that their confidentiality will be protected, that statement doesn't necessarily have a lot of teeth behind it without legally enforceable privacy protections in place. And so that's what I see the next phase is doing. It's introducing formal privacy laws into the picture. And another important thing that we see in this first attempt is some of the first attempts at disclosure limitation with some rudimentary cell suppression. So really, legally in 1880, they banned census taker from disclosing business and property responses. Information is a very powerful thing. And so census takers collecting this information, are gonna have a lot of power in some way, especially from people who want it. So if in the previous phase, they were told they couldn't do it, now in this phase, they are legally banned from doing it. Jail time was introduced for census takers who publish information, as well as fines as well. So they started putting some legal teeth, and making it legally very problematic for anyone to expose information that was collected within the census. In addition, another important milestone was the introduction of tabulating machines in 1890. So this made it much easier to tabulate information from the census into research tables. We had machines that were able to do it now, instead of interns or graduate students, whatever people were doing back in 1890 to put together these tables. They now had these table machines who could bring in the automation of these tables, which made them faster to create, which is great news for researchers, but a little tough on those of us who pay attention to confidentiality, because tabulating data releases more information to the public, which can be used to, identify people. So what are some famous confidentiality laws? Well, the first two laws that I'm presenting here are just general privacy laws that dictate how the federal government will manage the data that it collects from you. Cipsea is the big one that those of us in education and workforce data pay attention to. It strengthens confidentiality protections by codifying them under law. It limits the use of information collected under Cipsea to statistical purposes only. So anytime we use the data or we lend it out for someone else to use, an approved researcher, for instance, we get assurances that they will only use it for statistical research purposes only. They won't use it to target individuals for advertising or, direct marketing, or use it to make adjustments to people's health insurance rates or any other kind of regulatory function. You can't use this data for regulatory purposes, only statistical. And then it establishes very strong penalties, 10 years, up to 10 years or $250,000 fines for willful violation of Cipsea. People do things with data that is bad, but they don't mean to, and they don't know that they're doing it. So we really try and focus on people who are truly doing nefarious things with the data before we try to put them in jail. So the laws, while difficult to implement sometimes, are taken very seriously by those of us who need to pay attention to them, because we understand that not taking them seriously is, an ethical violation of trust that I have between my agency and myself and the respondent. And without that trust, response rates will plummet, the data quality will go down, and the data will be less useful than it was before. So it's really in everyone's vested interest to, keep these things safe, keep the data safe. The Privacy Act governs the collection, maintenance, use, and dissemination of PII about individuals that's maintained in a system of records by federal agencies. Think of a system of records as, essentially the results of a data collection. The government collects this data and, they're storing it in a database so we can do various things with it. The Privacy Act governs how we can access it and use it. For instance, we might not be able to access certain data sets by querying on someone's name. If I know that there is a celebrity, for instance, that has earned a PhD, I can't go into the system of records associated with that data set and search for, a famous celebrity who I think has got a PhD. Confidentiality laws are strong enough that we have exemptions from freedom of information requests from people. One of the exceptions, originally titled Exemption 3, incorporates various non-disclosure provisions that are contained in federal statutes. So responses that are protected under Cipsea, for instance, are exempted from a FOIA request because we've already given a promise that we won't release their data to people. So it is, that trumps a FOIA request that's out there. And we communicate what we intend to do with the data in a confidentiality statements that's on the cover of all of our questionnaires. Here, we say that we have the authority to collect this information from the NSF Act, and the information that you keep private will be protected under the NSF Act, which functions a lot like Cipsea, and or a portion of it functions a lot like Cipsea, not the whole thing, and the Privacy Act of 1974. So people could refer to this act to understand how it is that we will use the data. And then we even say that, how we intend to use it. Statistical or research purposes by the doctoral granting institution. This statement corresponds to our survey of earned doctorates that I mentioned earlier. Our contractors, and then a limited number of carefully designed follow-up studies. So we put forth how we intend to use this data. We're going to use it for research. Your doctoral institution is going to use it for research, and it's going to be used for a couple follow-up studies. In this case, one of our other surveys uses the data from the SED as a sampling frame. So we're telling them how it is that we are going to use it. So these things tend to be very important when you're undertaking a new survey or data collection. It's important to be pretty clear as to how you intend to use the data. Some of our surveys that aren't used up for follow-up studies would, not include this clause here, but we like to include them in the confidentiality statements. The next slide talks about some other confidentiality laws that you guys may have heard of. These are a little bit more agency and domain specific. The privacy rule, which is of which HIPAA is a part of this. It's the privacy rule sets national standards for the protection of very, very sensitive health information. And by very, very sensitive, I mean all health information is very, very sensitive. It's not that the privacy rule is protecting only certain types of health information. The type of entities that it covers are health plans, health clearinghouses, and healthcare providers who conduct healthcare transaction electronically. Covered entities must implement standards to protect and guard against the misuse of health information. FERPA is a law that affords parents the right to have access to their children's education records. So education records are sensitive, and until you are 18, your parent has the right to take a look at what these records are. Once you turn 18, FERPA rights are transferred to the child, so the parent no longer has access to a child's or their offspring's educational records once they turn 18. And then Title 13 is a census-specific law that makes it against the law to disclose or publish any private information about an individual. And again, it hits home this point about disallowing the use of personal information for non-statistical purposes. No regulatory stuff, just research. Census employees and anyone that uses raw or restricted use census data are sworn to uphold this law and are legally required to maintain the confidentiality of submitted data. And to get this Title 13 certification, you need to undergo some training. The training takes a little bit of quizzes, and then you need to, sign some legal documents that say you'll uphold these laws, and if you don't, then you understand what these penalties are. So those are some of the laws that I wanted to highlight for you that kind of govern overall how data is collected and protected within the federal government, as well as a few specific ones that are a little bit more domain specific that you might have heard of. So now the census has some formal confidentiality protections in place. They are codified as laws, so they're written down, and it just goes a little bit more than me giving you my word that I'll protect it. In addition to me giving you my word, if I break something, you can put me in jail for it or fine me. So the Bureau is using a combination of legal and, in essence, by no longer making the data publicly available in the town square, one could call it suppression. But not really variable or whole table suppression, whole census suppression. They just weren't making it available for people to use. But we don't want to do that. We want people to use this data because this information, you can do a lot of good with this information. So a couple different phase two milestones pushed privacy protections forward. And they were, as I mentioned before, the development of these tabulation machines, which could generate thorough tabulations more rapidly than could done so by hand, probably more accurately too. And then the use of suppression is a valid technique to mask respondents' identities, even if it was, over suppression. You can go back to the little snippet of data that I sent to you before, which is records of everyone earning PhDs in various fields at various schools. Well, I mean, I might want to generate tabs that summarize this data. It's nice to look at it by record level, but researchers, you sort of want to understand a little bit more fully what is in the data set. So with my handy new early 1900s tabulation machine, I can quickly generate tabs that summarize the data. So here I just did a little functional limitations, like I did a quick count of the functional of individuals with functional limitations within my data set, and I calculated what their median salary was. And then in addition to that, I did a quick distribution by gender, by race, to see what the demographic profile of people within this data set is. So, but you might see even, so if you can see in this one, this is clearly a problematic table because of the direct identifiers. Even here, you can see publishing these tabulations could be a bit problematic. Well, you might be wondering what's problematic. Well, this gender by race distribution has very few female Hispanics within the population. So I think it might be pretty easy to identify who these people are. What they did to protect this was essentially simply not publish the table. They oversuppressed a little bit as their first attempts to keep the data private, which is sort of a reasonable thing to do from a privacy perspective, but from a data utility perspective, it is a little bit overkill. I will take a quick stop and ask if there are any questions about anything I've spoke about so far. Take a quick sip of water.
Nope, everybody seems to be following right along with you.
Okay, great. So then we entered phase 3, and phase 3 began to realize, and in phase 3, researchers or census takers started to understand that people could use indirect identifiers to unmask identities and attributes of people. This in combination with the over suppression of results just by suppressing the whole table really caused statistical disclosure limitation techniques to be improved by leaps and bounds. They're still doing some over suppression. For instance, you could see in 1930, people were still, small area data was no longer published because they couldn't find a valid way to protect the identity of certain people. They were still doing whole data table suppressions in certain cases, especially with that small area data that I'd mentioned before. And they started to put forth secure research facilities to allow controlled access to more sensitive data. So in the 80s, they began to realize that the people were interested in this information, and if they could get some assurances from researchers that they weren't going to do anything nefarious data, we would allow broader access to data, but we want to watch you while you analyze it, and we want to make sure that you're not publicly putting anything out there. So I think it's interesting to note, while most of the laws that were put into place were to protect the public from potential misuse of the data by the government, the census data takers weren't the only ones who might be interested in using the data for non-statistical purposes. So reviewers of published census tables found that they could identify individuals using indirect identifiers, for instance. Intruders, which is what we call people who try and get after the data for nefarious purposes, could use combinations of indirect identifiers to identify people. And there's a pretty famous example that you may have heard of. It's William Weld, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And in '96, Governor Weld collapsed while receiving an honorary degree at Bentley University near Boston. And he was taken to a hospital where, as for any other patient, hospital staff created medical records that detailed what kind of care he had received, the tests that were run, what his diagnosis was, and the prescription that he was given upon leaving. The records were private. At least that was the intention of them. Around the same time, state employees in Massachusetts, including Weld, got health insurance through a company called Group Insurance Commission, who then decided that it would sell records to researchers. The GIC removed its identifiers such as patients' names and social security numbers. They'd stripped the data of what they thought were PII, and they thought that they were good to go to let researchers, hammer away at the data and come up with some interesting findings. Well, not everyone was interested in using this data to understand healthcare a little bit better. Graduate students in computer science at MIT had thought that the data wasn't actually very private. So what they did is they purchased voter registration records, which are publicly available, that included their name, voter's name, sex, date of birth, and zip code for a mere $20. And when these graduate students matched up the voter records with the health records, they found that there were only 6 possible patient records who could belong to could belong to Weld. Only 3 were men, and only 1 of them shared Weld's zip code. Therefore, they figured out which of these records was Weld, and then all of a sudden they had his health insurance, they had his diagnosis, they had his prescription, they had all this information about the governor that was supposed to be private, but the graduate students at MIT were, did this unmasked him pretty trivially. So indirect identifiers are really powerful, and the government was starting to understand this, and they started to introduce better techniques that could continue to protect our respondents. What did they do? Well, here is a tabulation from that same fake data set of doctorate earners from the University of Maryland by their gender and by their race. We get nice healthy counts in all of the cells, except for we only have 2 American Indian male graduates from the University of Maryland in that given year. So a data collector might look at this table and become nervous that they're only seeing 2 people there and feel it would be very easy to unmask such an intruder. So what does he or she decide to do? The field is suppressed from the table, and with a little footnote here that says the data was suppressed due to confidentiality. The table's protected, let's send it out. Well, is it really protected? No, not really. A crafty analyst could simply take the total, sum up the other counts, and then unmask that count of cell and show that it was a value of 2, which we know is the truth. So just by basically doing some simple basic arithmetic, anyone could very easily uncover what this cell is. So it's not enough to just suppress one cell. You have to suppress another cell in order to make the table not simply additive. You could select another cell from that table and also suppress that. And now you have some doubt. Well, you could know that, maybe 15 or so graduates were female white or male American Indians. There's a little doubt now. It's not as easy for an intruder to simply do the math to get 2. They would have to understand how the results were differentiated or distributed across these 2 values here. So oftentimes when you have a simple table like this, it's enough to suppress the value of what you want to protect, as long as you do another cell too, to reduce the intruder's ability to do that basic math. Obviously, the bad news when you suppress is that you lose data. And oftentimes people who are interested in small cell counts, well, they don't want to lose the data. So it's a problem now to balance what the researchers want, more data, with the confidentiality of the respondents. So in order to reduce the amount of data that lost comes from suppressing sensitive tables, an alternative method is to do random or controlled rounding. So essentially you're rounding the values to kind of mask the precision of what they are. And there are a couple ways that people do that. In random rounding, cell values are rounded, but instead of using a standard rounding convention, as I've demonstrated here, random rounding cell values are rounded, but they do it in controlled manner rather than just up and down like a typical random rule. So for example, one might decide to use some sort of linear function to determine what values get rounded and to what precision they will be rounded to. There might be an equation that's implemented in the background that defines how this random rounding is done, but it's a different way than doing the masking than just rounding up based on whatever level of precision that you're interested in doing. But because this rounding is done separately for each cell in a table, the rows and columns don't necessarily add to the published row and column totals. So one could either simply include a footnote that says the totals might not add to rounding, or you could do what's known as controlled rounding. And controlled rounding is another form of random rounding, in that you do some sort of linear equation in the background to define how the values are rounded, but it's constrained to have the sum of the published entries in each row and column equal to the appropriate marginal totals. And linear programming methods are often used to implement a controlled rounding mechanism into a table. You might supply a rounded table to a researcher for he or she to use. And if they see that the totals aren't matching to either within the table or to a published total that was perhaps put out by the agency, then they're not going to have a lot of confidence in the quality of the data. So the controlled rounding is a pretty good solution to that type of problem. If rounding isn't desirable, if you as a data provider or a researcher doesn't want to round the numbers, you can protect using another method called data coarsening. So coarsening is used to avoid suppression for small populations or combination of characters that appear to be unique. So here what we've done is we've aggregated different levels of race together to mask those small counts for unique races. In doctorate education, the underrepresented minority population usually refers to all other races besides white and Asian. So those are usually good candidates to roll up into a value. And then you could do the same thing with the minority populations. You could group them together if you wish, or you could just do, you could report those values separately if you have enough quantity, and then whatever's remaining could get rolled up into some sort of coarse level of the variable. So that's another technique that is commonly used to protect data. It is my personal favorite one because it's easy to put together and I think still provides good information about people as long as there's no well understood differences in how minority populations that are grouped together might be treated. It's a good path forward. Microdata is also something that we as data collectors like to reach out, like to provide to the public. It's one thing to present tables, but if researchers are interested in doing modeling, for instance, then they might want record level data rather than just tables. So in such cases, there's several ways that data can be protected. And one way that we do this is through sampling. So you could have a census data set that you are concerned and that you're concerned about privacy, but you still want to make record level data available to the public to do statistics on or other kind of analysis. You could sample. So rather than providing a full file, you sample a certain number of records. And the sampling itself provides protection. The estimates, you could also use a sampled record file to produce tables. You could produce estimates from the sampled record. From the sampled record set, and they're calculated by multiplying a respondent's data. You weight it up for sampling and non-response or whatever else that you want to apply for weights for. And so when the data is used to make these estimates concerning the population, they've been adjusted by these weights, and then the weighted totals take place of the actual frequencies in the published tables. So they're not the actual frequencies based on the count, but they're statistical estimates, which are oftentimes just as good as what the actual count is. But because the estimates or the file itself is based on sample data, an intruder can't actually tell, or they don't have as much confidence in that they've unmasked someone than if they had the census. They might look at the indirect identifiers that have been supplied and they might say, aha, this is Darius, I know it is. But since it's a sample, he doesn't have 100% confidence that it truly is me. And if he's really going after me, then sampling is a way to do protection. Blanket and impute is somewhat similar. Well, it's not really simpler. It's not really simpler, but here you take the records that you have and values that you want to suppress for an individual, you blanket out and you replace it with an imputed value. Thus, you're masking the true value and again, introducing some doubt to an intruder as to whether or not he actually has the, he or she's actually identified the person that he or she might be looking for. So again, it's a way to add noise or add noise to the data, which will inherently create some doubt in an intruder that they actually have the record that they're looking for. The last techniques that use is another noise infusion technique, or another way to introduce some error into the data intentionally, is swapping records. Well, what's swapping records? Again, we can take a look at an example. Here is our original data set. We might be interested in looking at tabulations of functional limitation, which is a very sensitive variable. I don't want potential employees knowing that, I have trouble seeing, or Matt Williams might have problems with potential employees knowing that he has some cognitive issues. They might not want to hire him or me if they know that these limitations exist. So what swapping does is identify sets of students who look similar on an established set of criteria, and then swap the values across matching records, or records that you've matched together as similar. So as a simple example of this, you can see that Jennifer and Chris are two students that look similar based on their gender and race. Swapping could work here by swapping the values that aren't our target value, the target value being the distribution that we're interested in creating, functional limitation, or the values that we've matched on. So instead, we might decide that we want to swap on degree and expected salary. And so boom, if we do that, we've swapped those two values. So now Jennifer has Chris's degree and expected salary, and Chris has Jennifer's degree and expected salary. And so an intruder might feel that he or she has uncovered an identity. They look at it, but in reality, they believe that the person that they've uncovered has an accounting degree rather than a biology degree. So again, we protect the underlying file, and that underlying file can be used for analysis, or that underlying file can be used to create tables. Theoretically, the marginal estimates of swap data should not be impacted by the swapping procedure, although it will impact some of the joint distributions that involve a swapped record. So once you start doing lots and lots of crosstabs, you have less confidence that your data is producing the right counts because it has that swap in it. But swapping theoretically will not impact the marginal totals, should they be done right. So swapping is a great way to protect data, especially if you're lending out a whole file. You're not only introducing doubt into the file by the swapping, like how do you know that a record that is truly what it says if you know that some form of swapping has taken place, and then it protects the microdata file from being matched to external files. If I want to match my file by gender, race, and degree to some sort of graduation record file or something like that, I am going to fail because my degrees have been perturbed. Okay, so any questions on that? On anything I've talked about over slide 3? It's really about, how SDL techniques have become more sophisticated with the understanding that indirect identifiers can be pretty disclosive.
We've got some questions coming in, but I think we're going to hold them till the end because it doesn't need clarifying right now. So
okay.
Go ahead and continue.
Sounds good. Phase 4, 20th century privacy threats. As you can tell, we're coming close to the end of the talk today. And really, I look at this time frame as 2010 to the present. Some of the major milestones in privacy during this period, we've started publishing, or data collectors such as the Census start publishing more results online. The web has democratized data, for lack of a better word. And while this is great for analysis and research purposes and information, it is certainly making things a bit more risky from a disclosure perspective. The Census and researchers are taking steps to control for this, and the technique that's been implemented for the 2020 census is called Differential Privacy, and we'll talk a little bit about high level what that means in a minute. But some of the milestones reached during this period: differential privacy is used in the census. Research data centers are fortified. So we talked about in the last phase how agencies wanted to allow approved researchers better access to more sensitive data. These things began beefed up, and online tool generators with statistical disclosure implementation are rolled out. So with this data online, agencies and other providers like to create tools for people to easily access and manipulate the data. They've been able to identify online tools with SDL implemented as rolled out. So let's go back to our example here. And it kind of illustrates how increase in available data can lead to disclosure. So considering the following scenario, one of our researchers has run the same analysis at 2 different time points and publishes the results in two different reports. It's again this census that the data source again is the census that NCSCS collects for all doctorate earners at US degrees. But as you know, sometimes people make mistakes in the way they fill out the data and they want to correct it. So it's not uncommon for raw underlying data to change between time points A and B. And that is what happened here. Specifically, the tabulations report that there was an additional graduate student added to the DRF between February and April 2022. And you can see that's reflected in these 2 tables in the cognitive limitation. The analysis conducted in 2019, there were 3 of them. And in this second analysis, there was perhaps a correction to the data, or maybe someone was added who didn't input their information before. The count of people that has a cognitive limitation is now up to 4. Crafty Intruder recognizes this discrepancy and surmises that this difference was likely caused by a doctorate earner graduating during the winter commencement. So in this case, it is not a mistake, but University of Maryland has a off-schedule winter commencement. So people who fill out the SED during winter, their data is going to come into NSF a little bit later, and as a result of that, analyses that were done before the data was added is going to be off. So if this intruder surmises that the doctorate earner graduated during the winter commencement, what he or she could do is consult the winter commencement program and find out that there was a person who received his or her doctorate in the winter commencement in agricultural economics. So I left this part of the data out, but this analysis is limited to doctorate earners in agricultural econ for a given year. So now not only has an intruder received his or her doctorate in ag econ, they've positively identified a person in this analysis with some very sensitive information that he or she has a cognitive limitation that could impact his or her ability to get a job if someone understands this. So we really want to correct it, but you can see what the problem is. It's difficult for data collectors to track and control every piece of analysis that comes out of the collector's shop. You want to avoid this, but how can you do that if you still want to continue to make this data available to the public to use? Well, the solution that researchers have come up with is synthetic data. So synthetic data is, it's fake data, essentially, but it's faked in such a controlled manner, so statistical estimates should be relatively close to what the truth is. You can create synthetic data by swapping. You could do imputation to create noise. You could remove records from the analysis and generate estimates with one record excluded from it. So a person doesn't know whether or not their information is contributed to the analysis so far, to the analysis. And that's what differential privacy is trying to do. It's hard to understand and it's hard to explain, but I'm going to try and do it because while it's not widely used as a protection technique, it is used in this year's census. So you'll probably hear a lot about it if you follow Census Bureau information. In particular, there have been some lawsuits associated with the census from different states for use of differential privacy, or in essence, introducing this noise into the data set. You know, I'm trying to describe what it is here, and it's a mathematical definition, so it's somewhat theoretical, of privacy in the context of statistical disclosure limitations. It's a criteria of privacy protection, which many tools for analyzing sensitive personal information have been devised to satisfy. Differential privacy is a property of an SDL mechanism rather than a technique in and of itself. So I might use swapping to mask the data, and if the result of that could be a differentially private data set. Differential privacy is not the swapping technique in and of itself, it's a property of the data set. And an analysis of the data is designed to be differential private. Then the following is guaranteed. Data scientists or database managers analyzing trends cannot directly access the raw data, and services on an individual level will not change based on an individual's participation in the data set. So it's a fancy way of saying, you know, results will not necessarily change if my data was included versus if my data was not included. That's in essence what this is saying. And this slide is a useful diagram for trying to describe differential privacy in action. It outlines two scenarios where the top one represents the limitation analysis using all respondents. So the bottom scenario represents you know, the same limitation analysis that we looked at before, but this time with that winter commencement student opting out of the survey. So really the bottom scenario is essentially the same analysis performed, but this time without this winter commencement student included. Because this information is omitted from the analysis, his privacy is protected in the sense that the outcome does not depend on his or her specific information. The outcome is not going to change whether this commencement graduate details are omitted or, you know, or different. So that's what differential privacy is. It's more of a it's trying to say if a data set's differential private set, it's going to have these guarantees that your information can't be surmised with the data. So I think that is it. I wanted to leave you with a couple of references that will provide a lot more detail and technical information about these different techniques, what SDL, the different techniques that the different SDL techniques that different agencies use, how to evaluate, you know, data sets and tables for disclosure risk in addition to utility. It is a wealth of information. The first link is a website. It is new. It provides an overview of techniques and different ways to assess them. It is not, the website's not complete yet. It has some holes in it, but luckily it is based on what's known as, it's based on a document known as Working Paper 22, which essentially tries to do all of the things that this website does, but in a document rather than a website. CDAC that I refer to here is the Confidentiality and Data Access Committee. It is an interagency working group of feds who are particularly interested in these types of problems. And one of our products is to help people understand disclosure and how to work on it. And we want to provide resources for people to do that. So those two things are right there. They'll go into a lot more detail about the techniques that I've discussed today. They don't really talk much about history, So they're good sources for more technical information. Thanks, and I am happy to stop sharing now, and I will take any questions that people have.
Thank you very much. That was such interesting information. There was so much there thrown in that history that we just didn't know. We do have several questions, so I'm going to get started. But the first one I'm going to ask it specifically has to do with sort of our overall focus, which is about disaggregation of race. The question is, do you have any recommendations or ideas for balancing disclosure risk and disaggregation of race data? The questioner says, we recently prepped an A4 presentation on balancing data democratization with data disclosure risk, and we are always looking for recommendations or ideas from others doing similar work.
Yeah, I think working paper 22 has a lot of good technical ways, different measures that you can use to assess this balance of risk and utility. I mean, sort of without getting into too many technical details, things that I've done, like say, for example, I decide that the most efficient way to mask a data set that's a census is to take a sample of records. Like you might take a sample of records, do a little bit of perturbation on them, and then create different estimates and see how close that they're coming to what the true estimate would be. And you'd expect them to be within a reasonable confidence interval, that they're together, that they're not that the estimates from the mass data versus the raw data aren't statistically different. You can make different measures associated with that. I'm also really into breaking data sets. So rather than just adopting some of the algorithms that you'll find in working paper 22, actually creating a tabulation and then using different data products that either NCSES produces or data products that are publicly available, and seeing if I can uncover people. And that's a very powerful way to show that your data is or is not protected. But working paper 22, I think, will provide some actual metrics that people can use to show that their data is protected or not. But I feel that getting that kind of feel by working with the data is really the best way to go.
Great. And we will drop those links into the chat so that everybody can grab them.
Yeah, definitely.
Dr. Ponce actually has a question that ties this back to some of our previous presentations. We've heard a lot about privacy loss parameter, and it's hard to understand. Can you explain that? Can you make that a little bit more digestible for us?
I can try. It's really what I was going for with it's what differential privacy is defined by, the privacy parameter. And I'll admit I'm not great up to speed on it. So probably what I'll do is I'll send AJ a couple of good links that do a better job of explaining it that I can, for people to look at once they leave. But the parameter, like when you're doing differential privacy, you have an acceptable amount of what's the best way to say it? Like you're willing to accept a certain amount of differences in the instance of privacy. And the parameter is a mathematical way to set what that bound is. I think that's the best way to put it. And so for each different product that you put out, you're going to lose some of that privacy, and that's going to affect that parameter. And so I think what the differential privacy people do is they set some sort of a target for what that parameter is, and then they try to achieve it. So it's really trying to quantify, an acceptable level of risk for you. But I think in some of the documents I'll send later, it'll explain that a little bit better than I have. I got to be frank. I mean, differential privacy, it's a tough nut to swallow. And without using it within agencies right now, it's hard for me to take the time to get a real grasp on it, to best understand how it is that it's being used. But now that Census is implementing it, we're going to be doing well, we're probably going to be a lot of seminars on what it is. But I feel I'm probably with the person who asked that question a bit too. It's hard to understand.
Great. The next question, wondering if these masking techniques are always transparent. That is, will data users always be able to find out what kinds of masking techniques were used?
No, definitely not. You might get you might be able to get some information. Like, so when we talked about like swapping, for instance, I might want people to know that I've done swapping, so they know that to introduce that doubt into the data set. So if they are going to use it for something wrong, they have that kind of question in their own heads as to whether or not they've really actually uncovered the right record. But what I would not tell someone is the swapping rate. So I would not tell someone what percentage of records has undergone swapping. I would keep that parameter to myself. Same thing with cell suppression. If you look at a set of published tables, you're going to see that suppression was done, but you're not going to know what the threshold was. Like, was it 3? Was it just if you're under 3 people, do I suppress you then? Or is it under 10? Now, crafty people can do some math and oftentimes figure out what this is, but I wouldn't tell people what the parameter I use to suppress or swap or any kind of protection. Same thing if I did a blanket impute. I might tell you that I've done it to protect the data, but I'm not going to tell you which values. That would defeat the purpose.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
What implications, if any, does CIPSEA have for data collected in state or local surveys?
That's a good question. It's for state and local. So you're talking about like invoking the law? Is that what you're asking? I mean, I could see if a state and local survey, well, I don't know if Cipsea can be applied to state and local surveys. So I only know it really at the federal level. But that's not to say it can. I'm just not sure. And I don't want to tell you the wrong answer and you try and apply in a law that doesn't exist or is not applicable to you. But, I think it provides teeth that, I think it provides, assurances to the respondent that these things are taken very seriously. If we find out that someone violates this, we have authority, legal authority, to send them to jail or to fine them. We can really go after them. So I think if you can add a legal protection to your collection, it'll improve response rates, people knowing that this type of thing is taken seriously. I mean, I think privacy is it's important, and it's important to people. And you can see, some of the reactions that people have had to understanding that all the data that they have given to, certain online companies like Facebook or whatever that have been collected, they've been using that data for something that they, didn't sign up for. You sign up for Facebook thinking that you're gonna, do a poke of people from time to time or post a nice picture. And then next thing you know, your data is being used for marketing. And that's how Facebook is making their money. But people don't like that. So if they understood that you're taking these protections seriously, there's a good chance it'll increase your response rates.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a recommended guide to the methods to protect confidentiality? For example, how would one go about doing random rounding?
Yeah, I would do, working paper 2 really gets into the technical aspects of it. There is a lot of research on this as well. So if you get into working paper 22, which I think, so if I've given you an overview, working paper 2 will go into several levels deeper. And then if you want more information, there's tons of research that has been done on how to protect data and different ways to do it. But yeah, again, I would recommend going to working paper 22 or that website, and they can give you more specific technical instructions on different ways that you could implement some of these techniques in your work. So yeah, I mean, I would go heavily on that resource again.
Wonderful. Well, that's all the official questions that we have in the Q&A. Dr. Ponce, did you want to wrap up anything for us?
Good cue. I have so many, thoughts and follow-ups. And we only have 4 minutes, but Darius, thank you so much for presenting it. I have to say, all of the what do you call them, statistical disclosure limitations, SDLs, are disturbing to me. from the mission of trying to get as much disaggregated data by race, ethnicity for groups, and some of the coarsening, of course, like for example, you had Asian with white together. It was an example, and there's so some coarsenings then may not be appropriate, depending on the research question, of course, and the policy, and also in terms of at least adhering to minimum standards of race, ethnicity, population, and reporting.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, it's always it's a tough population to manage, especially when you're studying doctoral errors, when you start to get into some of the minority races and the, esoteric fields that people get degrees in, you're getting down to like 1 or 2 people.
Right.
So it's hard to report that information. I showed I showed a way of aggregating races together, but you could do years, or you could do fields,
right. You can
for instance.
Yeah, right.
It just depends what your target is.
Right, but I think it is important to see all of these techniques for the data consumers and data advocates that I know are part of this community that we have in this series of promoting a culture of health. It's funded by our WJF, and one of that is getting it more granular around racial ethnic categories. I thought it was really important to understand that, and thank you also. I thought you did a swell job of explaining that privacy loss.
Oh yeah.
So,
oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm sure someone else would say otherwise, but
I hope we can continue to consult with you.
Oh, absolutely.
And also that we can share some of other insights that we're getting from our other experts, from our advocates, on what would be important in terms of this balance. That question was excellent, that was posted between democratizing data and and ensuring that we're mitigating data disclosure. I also particularly did not know about all that history about federal marshals, and I hate to say how that would not be great to have in this climate of
oh God, that'd be terrible.
Deportation.
Yeah.
So I wanted to thank you again, a lot to thank, and for the resources that you shared for us, which will be posted by our team here, and also makes me think about, again, in the doctorates, part of it is, it's not the data piece, but it's of course the workforce piece, the equity piece, to make sure that there's a diversification of folks get doctorates in the United States. So thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Being part of our data disaggregation community, and we hope you'll join us in
yeah, this is great. I've really enjoyed it.
AJ, are you going to say something about the next one? We don't have quite a date.
We don't have an official date, but we do have 2 more topics that we are already planning on covering. Looking at legal and policy implications for disaggregating data. And wow, I just totally blanked on the other. Oh, and working on imputation.
Imputation.
Another very another very technical topic, but with someone who is really going to help us walk through techniques and strategies to use good imputation methodology to work with more racially granular data. So look for those announcements about those dates officially coming out. Thank you all. Go to our website, please. I beg you to go and fill out the post-workshop survey and let us know if there's any other topics that you want to hear from. And with that, everybody have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. All the best to everyone. Thank you, Darius.
Thanks so much.